Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Say What podcast. Today, we will be finishing up our three-part mini-series on the different scopes to measure and track your ESG mandates. I have brought back Jeff Dyra today to help me discuss Scope 3. Thank you for being here with me today, Jeff.
Thank you for having me again, Jill.
Okay, so let's get right to it and start with the basics. What are Scope 3 emissions, and what do our listeners need to keep in mind about Scope 3?
Scope 3 emissions are generated when a product is being created. Some of the important things our listeners need to keep in mind is that Scope 3 emissions are the most complex and difficult to measure. The reason for this is that they are basically out of the organization's direct control, which just leads to more and more headaches and more layers of procedures. This is important to keep in mind because the business, in the end, is not only going to have to determine which categories they're going to choose from to meet their goals, but they're also going to have to put time into measuring their emissions in these categories. Overall, there are 15 categories that can be measured, and each category has a specific measurement calculation to compute your emissions. On top of that, the categories are further divided into upstream and downstream activities. This divide directly affects the supply chain participants and requires each member to adjust their energy consumption and purchasing strategy to ensure they meet their Scope 3 requirements set by the end product seller.
Wow, thank you, Jeff. I was not aware that Scope 3 was this complex. Based on what you just said, upstream and downstream activities seem important. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the area where a lot of organizations get confused because while we as the end user see the finished product, there are multiple steps before that product gets into your hands. So let's talk about the upstream activities and what they include. This can include all emissions resulting in organizations' work to secure and manufacture the purchased goods and services for that product. Some examples of this could include transportation, waste generated in operations, fuel and energy related activities for employees to commute, and business travel to finalize sales. And this is, to be honest with you, can become extremely overwhelming to track. On the other end of the activities is the downstream side of things. This encompasses the period after the goods and services have left an organization's facility, right? So picture a truck picking up your product and bringing it to the end user. So this is included in your emissions or what has to be measured on your downstream activities. So your delivery trucks, your contact made with local store or vendors, and anything that's going to go to the end user must be tracked for not only you, but also for all of the people in your supply chain. Overall, there are lots of moving parts to account for to ensure that you're meeting your Scope 3 goals.
After listening to everything you've just said, it does seem like that is the case. So, what can a company do to help them ensure that they meet their requirements as best they can?
In general, companies can take a more in depth look into the measuring of your emissions and set up a plan to continue to meet your Scope 3 goals. If anyone listening is curious about where to start, and this is typically the hardest part, or how to do that, our advisors are always happy to help and would be able to let you know what options would be available in your local area.
So, if a company has the goal to get to net zero, what advice would you give them to help them strive to meet their goal?
Achieving net zero is no easy task, Jill. No one, but one thing is for sure, and this is one thing I know, you will need a strategy and a way to measure your progress. After setting a goal that begins with a timeline, most companies will purchase renewable energy certificates, purchase emission free energy certificates, or use energy from an offset renewable source as a potential option to offset their carbon emissions. Another option is to take a combination of all of these three and customize a plan for individuals' customers' goals. There are also multiple different platforms that are available that can help with tracking, and we as advisors can work with the customers on their individual needs to find which platform best is suited for them.
Thank you, Jeff, for being here with me today. That concludes our mini series, and thank you to everyone for listening. And stay tuned for our next Say What podcast.